Hey guys, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we will be watching Wellington's Triumph, Vitoria 1813 by Epic History TV. So in the last video in the series, we were sort of on the build-up to a massive battle between Napoleon and his European opponents. I think this is a step away from that because we're back to Wellington. Last time we saw him, he was operating in Spain, with his joint force of Brits and Portuguese troops, and also, there were Spanish forces fighting the French. So I think we're sort of taking a step back from what Napoleon was doing at the moment and returning to Wellington, who's obviously another important figure in this whole conflict. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this one, and let's jump right in. Yeah, I mean, last time we checked in on, the French effort in Spain, it was not going well for France. As we've talked about it for a while now. We talked about it a lot in the last video. If Napoleon is there, the French are probably doing okay, unless it's in Russia. If Napoleon is absent, the French struggle. And that was the issue in Spain, was that Napoleon could not be everywhere at once, and wherever Napoleon wasn't, the French were, often overstretched. They had too many situations to worry about and not enough men to handle those situations, so they were really struggling against British, Portuguese, and Spanish forces.
May 1813. While Napoleon's Grande Armée began its fight back in Central Europe following the disastrous invasion of Russia, 1,200 miles away, at the other end of Napoleon's embattled empire, another enemy was poised to strike. The previous year, Wellington's Anglo-Portuguese army had won a brilliant victory at Salamanca, but been held at Burgos and forced into a long, demoralizing retreat back to the Portuguese frontier.
Yeah, Wellington had a very back and forth experience as far as what we've seen. Driving further in, attacking the French forces who were scattered throughout the country. Then the French would consolidate and push him back. But this video is called Wellington's Triumph, so I feel we may see this whole thing come to an end.
But after a winter of rest, reinforcement and training, Wellington's army was stronger than ever. 100,000 men, many of them battle-hardened veterans. And for the first time, he had sufficient cavalry and artillery, while transport and medical services had also been improved. Morale was sky-high. Their chief, known to the troops as Old Nosey, was cheered wherever he went. I never saw the British Army so healthy or so strong, Wellington informed London.
Yeah, obviously, what we've seen so far is that Britain has mainly prosecuted the war at sea. That's where they've been dominant. But in terms of, their land forces, Wellington, he's the hero there. He's the main guy you think of when you think of Britain's forces on land. He's the one who dominates that conversation. And it seems to be going particularly well for him and the Brits at the moment.
In contrast, the French position in Spain was weaker than ever.
Ooh.
Napoleon severely underestimated the threat posed by Wellington and had just withdrawn 20,000 French troops for his own use in Germany. As commander-in-chief, King Joseph knew his forces were overstretched. Napoleon allowed him to give up Madrid and move his capital to the more easily defended Valladolid. But withdrawing further, to a strong position like the Ebro River, was out of the question. That would send the wrong message to neutral Austria and Napoleon's wavering German allies. And so, with serious concerns, Joseph and his chief of staff, Marshal Jourdan, awaited Wellington's offensive.
Yeah, so, we mentioned the removal of troops from Spain to aid Napoleon elsewhere in the last video. And, now the issue is that France isn't just overstretched in Spain, but they're overstretched in general. Napoleon has retreated from Russia, missing most of the troops he left with, and now he has to gather up a new army as quickly as possible. An army that is not nearly as well trained and disciplined as the one he had before, and he needs troops desperately, and so some have to come from the Spanish front. But, the French forces there, they already don't have enough men to win this conflict. So, the situation is just getting worse and worse for the French forces.
This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, the free-to-play RPG in which you build a team of champions.
All right, well, we've got a Raid Shadow Legends advertisement, pretty, quite a meme. But, go check out the original video, check out their sponsor. I'll link their video down below. Shout out to Epic History TV. Go show them some love, all that good stuff.
Champions to the Banner Lords. Fallen under the influence to get to the bottom of the mystery. Banner Lord champions, 100.
Good stuff.
With history team for getting into rather. Champions will need to level up and players. Use the link below to download.
All right, so go check their video out and go check their sponsor out.
Raid for Peace for sponsoring this video.
Yeah, and this quote highlights something sort of important, which is the Spanish frontier, though it hasn't necessarily been key to the overall conflict, apart from, being a massive sink for French resources and men, is important because it's right on the border with France. The Pyrenees Mountains separate the two countries right along the border. And Napoleon, up until this point, hasn't faced... he's faced most of his serious military challenges to the east of France, and often far away from France's border. But the issue here is that, you get through Spain, and where are you? Well, you're on French soil. So if you are facing a serious threat in Spain, it's really, really bad.
Wellington's plan was for his army to advance in two wings, concentrate at Toro, then move against Joseph's forces. In the south, Murray's Anglo-Sicilian Spanish force, based in Alicante, had just repelled an attack by Marshal Suchet at the Battle of Castalla. Murray would now mount a diversionary landing on the Mediterranean coast to coincide with Wellington's advance and prevent Suchet sending reinforcements north. Wellington had also counted on large-scale support from Spanish regular forces, of which he was, since November 1812, theoretically commander-in-chief. But the
Yeah, we might be about to get into this, but we had seen some sort of clashes between the Spanish and the British. Not military clashes, but they weren't necessarily getting along super well. They were having a hard time collaborating against the French.
Spanish Cortes, based in Cadiz, was deeply divided, with many still highly suspicious of British motives. The result was that Wellington would only receive direct support from a few reliable Spanish divisions. Fortunately, he would receive considerable Spanish support from the guerrillas, now better armed, organized, and operating in greater numbers than ever before. A large area of Valencia had effectively been liberated by El Fraile, the Friar. Esposimina had captured major towns in Navarre and was currently keeping General Clausel's Army of the North busy, while Juan Martín Díaz, aka El Empecinado, was tying down large numbers of French troops near Madrid.
Yeah, and we've already seen how the guerrilla forces were very influential in, challenging French control over the country, particularly the countryside, and they were really damaging French supply lines, communication lines, not to mention attacking French forces and killing a lot of French men. So we've already seen the importance of these guerrilla fighters, and now we're seeing it in a much more direct way as, Wellington plans to make his assault. Well, the guerrilla forces are still there, and they're still doing their thing. So even if he can't secure as much support as he would want from the central Spanish government, he has it from the guerrilla forces. Although on the central Spanish government, it was kind of complicated. I mean, there wasn't a ton of centralized control. Everything was kind of chaotic at this point. The country is occupied by France, so there's a bit of a struggle for control. Not to mention there was some disorder erupting in the Spanish colonies at the moment, so the government didn't have a whole lot of control in the first place, and they were also suspicious of British motives. Well, fair enough, I guess. We're not going to come back to visit?
On the 22nd of May, Wellington bid farewell to Portugal and began his advance. 4 days later, he was in Salamanca, from where he joined the northern wing of his army under Sir Thomas Graham. Joseph and Jourdan expected Wellington's main thrust to come from Salamanca, so planned to defend the line of the Douro River. But Graham's rapid advance north of the river meant they'd already been outflanked, and they ordered a retreat.
Oh no.
By a series of brilliant marches, Wellington continued threatening the French right flank, forcing Joseph to keep falling back.
See, and you're always thinking, man, perhaps if Napoleon was there, he would have been able to do something, with his tactical and strategic brilliance. But he's not. He is otherwise occupied. He's dealing with his own set of serious issues with, his other European opponents. So he can't be here. So we have to rely on the French, subordinates, mainly Joseph, who is sort of in charge of this whole thing. And in this case, Wellington is sort of outplaying him.
Wellington's army was able to use small roads and mountain tracks north of the main highway, which the French had dismissed as impassable. But thanks to his Spanish allies, Wellington knew better. Backed by British sea power, he was also now able to switch his supply base from Lisbon to Santander, drastically reducing the length of his supply lines, another feat the French had written off as impossible. At the Ebro River, the French found themselves outflanked yet again.
Isn't it crazy? We were just talking about a couple minutes ago how Joseph had refused to back up to the Ebro River because, it would send a really bad message internationally. Well, now he's there, and he's been forced to back up there. So you can see how quickly the situation is deteriorating for the French forces.
And fell back to Vitoria.
Here we are.
Here, Joseph decided that he must make his stand.
Yeah.
The Zadorra River valley west of Vitoria seemed to offer a strong defensive position. Expecting an attack from the west, French forces were drawn up in 3 lines. General Gazon's army of the south formed the first line. Then General d'Erlon's army of the centre. Then General Rey's army of Portugal. Joseph hoped that he could at least buy time for the vast wagon convoy assembled east of the city to get away. It contained not only military supplies, but his government's treasury. And, as satirized by this contemporary British cartoon, the accumulated loot of 5 years' French occupation of Spain, including priceless works of art, jewels, and antiques.
Yeah, we talked about in earlier videos how some French commanders in particular were very into looting priceless works of art, looting, just important valuables to the Spanish. And the French had done a lot of looting while they were there. which obviously doesn't necessarily help when you're trying to legitimize your rule over their country as a foreign invader. Looting all their stuff, will probably make them angrier. Not that the French really had a chance to rule over them in the first place, even if they'd done it well.
He also expected General Clausel to arrive with 20,000 reinforcements any day. However, thanks to the guerrillas, Wellington was better informed of Clausel's whereabouts than Joseph himself. Knowing that Clausel couldn't reach Joseph before the 22nd of June, he decided to attack on the 21st.
Okay.
The day before, French patrols reported enemy troop movement to the north, so Rey's troops were moved to cover any threat to the army's line of communications. Apart from one division, which left to escort part of the wagon convoy to France. An odd decision that deprived the army of 4,000 men on the eve of battle. Marshal Jourdan had been bedridden with fever that day. The next morning, he reconnoitred the army's position with King Joseph. They agreed that their position was overextended and should be shortened. But by the time their orders reached General Gazan, it was too late. He was already under attack.
Yeah, and so we can see throughout this preparation phase the impact that the Spanish guerrillas had on this fight. They were providing Wellington with the information he needed and the information that Joseph couldn't get. So he was able to plan more accordingly. He was able to maneuver in a more intelligent way. He's already got a pretty huge advantage due to, the better maneuverability of his army and the better information that he has.
Wellington, enjoying the advantage in numbers for once, had decided to attack in 4 columns across a 10-mile front, with General Graham's left-hand column threatening Joseph's line of retreat. It was a bold plan, with the potential to trap and destroy Joseph's army, but required careful coordination and precise timing. Fortunately, the French had not thought it necessary to destroy any of the bridges over the Zadorra River, which was also fordable in several places. At 8 a.m., General Hill's column began its attack on the Allied right. Spanish and British troops advanced up the western heights of Puebla, driving off French skirmishers, and forcing General Gazan to send reinforcements to secure his left flank. Hill's troops then seized the village of Subiana, but French cannon fire and counterattacks prevented any further advance. Convinced that Hill's attack was the main assault, and that troop movements to the north were probably a diversion, Jourdan continued to send troops from the centre to reinforce the left. This was exactly what Wellington wanted. But at 11 a.m, he was waiting with growing impatience for his other columns to go into action. Lord Dalhousie's 7th Division, supposed to be leading the attack by the centre-left column, had got held up in the mountains. While further east, Graham's flanking move had got off to a cautious start.
Well, Wellington has been more successful with maneuverability, but, even he's experiencing some difficulties. Everything can't go perfectly. So, I guess we'll see how exactly he deals with, this movement that's slower than he would prefer, to put it that way.
But seeing the size of the approaching force, General Rey decided to pull back his troops across the Zadorra River. This encouraged Graham to get things moving.
Okay, nice.
Colonel Longa's Spanish division advanced on Durana, held by Spanish troops loyal to King Joseph, and a bitter struggle for the village ensued. British and Portuguese infantry advanced against Camara Mayor. They were soon engaged in bloody street fighting with the French. This scene shows an attack by the 4th King's Own Regiment of Foot and the 47th Lancashire Regiment.
Yeah, we've seen some urban warfare during this, but it is obviously particularly brutal. This image portrays that to a certain extent, but just think about it. As opposed to the traditional column on column, we've got street by street fighting. Troops are defending every position they can hold. Oftentimes it's hand to hand combat. It's a particularly brutal and dangerous style of combat.
Though they succeeded in driving the French out of the village, they could not cross its bridge over the Zadorra, which was expertly covered by French guns. Around noon, a Spanish peasant informed Wellington that the bridge at Tres Puentes was completely unguarded. He immediately ordered Kempt's elite light infantry brigade to dash.
Once again, and this is similar to the Spanish guerrillas, this is the benefit of having the locals on your side. Local forces or local civilians, because there are people all around, and they'll notice things. And hopefully they will let you know about those things, particularly if they're important to the cause, and you can take advantage of it. This is what the French as sort of foreign occupiers are missing. And obviously, the Brits are also foreign, but even though the Spanish have suspicions of them, they have promised that they're fighting for Spanish liberation. So, this is the benefit having the locals on your side. And we see this with many conflicts throughout history. We saw this with the American Revolution, which wasn't that long ago, in 1813, It wasn't that, the French Revolution occurred only a bit after the American Revolution. So, we can kind of see the benefit of having local people with you instead of against you.
Dash across it and secure a bridgehead. But there was still little sign of Dalhousie's 7th Division. General Picton, the notoriously short-tempered commander of the fighting 3rd Division, ran out of patience. Fed up with waiting for Dalhousie, he ordered his men to advance. They charged across the Mendoza Bridge and a nearby ford, driving back light French defences. General Gazan, with his left flank pinned down at Subiana, was now about to be outflanked on his right, and had no option but to pull back his troops.
Wow.
Wellington's army was now crossing the Zadorra River in force. Heavy fighting continued to rage on the heights of Puebla, but here the French also had to give ground to maintain the cohesion of their new line.
I don't know exactly how this goes, but, one, I can read the title, and two, this is looking really bad for the French right now. They're falling back at almost every position they hold. So it is not going well for them.
Scottish Highlanders and Connaught Rangers, supported by riflemen and Portuguese troops, now stormed the village of Arigneth.
Particular shout out to the Scottish Highlanders. We've got the flag up behind me, the Lion Rampant, one of the flags of Scotland, so we got to give a shout out there.
Routing the defenders, who retreated southeast, and a gap began to emerge in the French centre between Gazan's army of the south and Derland's army of the centre.
Uh-oh.
The Allied advance continued, with heavy pressure on both French flanks. Wellington's army appeared to be building unstoppable momentum.
Yeah.
With Graham's column poised to cut off Joseph's escape.
It looks like the French are about to be surrounded. They're being flanked on both sides. If it continues like this, the French escape is going to be cut off, and they're going to be in big, big trouble.
By 4 p.m, Wellington's army was formed up across the Zadorra, ready to strike a decisive blow. But his infantry came under heavy fire from 76 French guns, blasting great holes in their ranks. Allied guns were brought forward to provide support. The biggest artillery duel of the Peninsular War began.
Wow.
More than 70 guns on each side. Allied skirmishers, exploiting the gap in the French centre near Gomecha, were able to work their way behind the French guns and shoot down their crews. Gazan found himself threatened on both flanks. But instead of trying to close up with D'Erlon to his north, on his own initiative he ordered a retreat that left D'Erlon's own left flank completely exposed.
Uh-oh. So, we've talked about sort of the action of subordinates before, how them acting independently can be a positive or a negative. Seems like in this case it was definitely a negative, Perhaps he seems like he was pretty desperate. Perhaps he didn't have any time to consult. But just ordering sort of an independent retreat, that is, I can only imagine, going to make the situation much worse for the French forces overall.
Around the same time, Longa's Spanish troops finally captured Durana, and rumors swept the French army that their escape route had been cut.
Yeah.
D'Erlon's army of the centre fought on bravely, withdrawing to another new defensive line just 1 mile west of Vitoria. French guns kept up a steady fire on the advancing Allied lines.
Okay, I'll give some respect to the French forces. They are keeping discipline. They're fighting hard. This is obviously extremely brutal. But they're fighting well. They're doing what they can in the face of a very dangerous situation.
But once more, the position was outflanked.
Yeah.
Around 5:30 p.m., King Joseph bowed to the inevitable and ordered a general retreat.
Wow.
As the main road to France had now been cut by Longa's Spanish troops, the army would have to retreat east towards Pamplona along a single narrow road with boggy fields on either side. Bad enough for thousands of troops and guns, but there had been no attempt to move off the army's enormous convoy of wagons earlier in the day. The result was pandemonium, as military units and artillery tried to force their way through the streets of Vitoria and the congested lanes and fields beyond. The task of forming a rearguard fell to General Rey's Army of Portugal, which conducted an organized withdrawal covered by its cavalry. Wellington hoped that Graham's column would now be surging across the Zadorra River to cut off the French army's retreat. But Graham, overestimating the enemy's strength, continued to take a cautious approach.
It seems like some of Wellington's subordinates, particularly Graham, were not as decisive as he was. And of course, just as Napoleon can't be everywhere at once, neither can Wellington. He's overseeing the battle, but, this is 1813, and this is a large battle. He can only maneuver his forces so much. He has to rely on his subordinates, and they sometimes may not make the decisions that he would make.
East of Vitoria, the French retreat descended into total chaos. The single narrow road became blocked. Wagons that took to the fields got stuck and were abandoned. Allied cavalry fell upon this confused mass.
It's a shame, because it seems like they fought hard, and, they were doing a fairly disciplined retreat, but, when you're retreating across one, muddy road with the entire army, its supplies, the loot, it's going to descend into chaos. It's not going to go well for you.
Spreading panic and meeting little serious opposition, King Joseph and Marshal Jourdan themselves narrowly escaped capture.
Wow.
Among the abandoned wagons, many civilians, including officers, wives and children, priceless paintings, jewels and furniture, and more than 5 million gold francs. troops on both sides broke ranks and dived into an orgy of plundering.
Well, that's not great. Just can't help themselves, I guess. Probably best not to loot the people you've come to save, looting from the Spanish who you've come to liberate. But, I suppose it is what it is.
One British officer described the scene. About dusk, the head of our column came suddenly on some wagons which had been abandoned by the enemy. Someone called out, "They are money carts." No sooner were the words uttered than the division broke as if by word of command, and in an instant the covers disappeared from the wagons and nothing was seen but a mass of inverted legs, while the arms were groping for dollars. For money it certainly was. The scene was disgraceful, but at the same time, ludicrous.
Yeah, it seems like it. That's also what I would call it. It's pretty shameful. But, at the same time, it's kind of hard to expect any more in this situation where this massive chaotic retreat and the French have left a bunch of their stuff behind, which is actually the stuff of the Spanish who they looted it from. It's kind of unsurprising that this looting would take place.
Wellington, however, was furious. Not only did the plundering delay pursuit of the enemy, but giant sums of cash, which might have paid for his army's supplies, vanished into private pockets instead. Of 5.5 million francs, only 250,000 were ever recovered by the army.
Wow.
Vitoria was a great victory for the coalition. Not as crushing as it might have been, reflected in relatively light French casualties. But in the chaotic retreat that followed, the Allies did capture all but 2 of 153 French guns, and even Jourdan's Marshal's bateau.
Just to rub it in. Yeah, it seems like this was a really decisive defeat for the French. Though I will say, of course, that is a lot of men captured, wounded, or killed, but it's not nearly as many as I thought it would be. Probably due to, we saw that until the retreat really fell apart, it was fairly orderly and the French fought well. So, I'm not terribly surprised, but I am a little surprised that, there weren't more casualties on the French side.
French military power in Iberia was broken. The Bonapartist Kingdom of Spain was at an end. Joseph returned to France to face his brother's criticism. Marshal Jourdan retired from active service. Napoleon sent Marshal Soult to replace them, but even his shrewd military mind could not turn the tide in Spain. Counterattacks to relieve the French garrisons at Pamplona and San Sebastian were defeated. That autumn, Wellington began what proved an unstoppable advance across the Pyrenees and into France.
And this is exactly what I talked about at the beginning of this video. French power in Spain has been broken, and that means that the British forces are now at the French border, which is, probably the worst possible situation you could be in. This is the first time the French border has been threatened in quite a while, and all because, the French could not hold Spain. And so it's led to this really dangerous situation for them.
In southern Spain, where Marshal Suchet remained undefeated, the disaster at Vitoria forced him also to withdraw towards the frontier, leaving behind just a few isolated garrisons. After a bitter 5-year struggle, the Allies had brought the Peninsular War, to the Spanish their War of Independence, to a victorious conclusion. It had been a long, hard road, steeped in blood and suffering. The alliance between Britain and Spain had been particularly treacherous to navigate. But ultimately, both nations had fought together with Portugal to drive the French back across the Pyrenees.
Yeah.
New research provides a clearer insight than ever into the huge attrition of French manpower in Iberia. An estimated total of 260,000 lives lost. 3/4 died of sickness. Of approximately 66,000 deaths from combat, 43% were in actions against Spanish regular forces, 38% fighting British-led armies, and 19% fighting guerrillas.
This is a pretty interesting breakdown. Of course, we can see the massive amount of men that died from sickness, which was just very common at that point. Perhaps more than I would have expected, though. I mean, that looks about 75%. I might have said closer to like 60, but still, it's not surprising that a lot of the men who died from illness. And then we could see a breakdown of, how many died versus Spanish, British, and guerrilla forces. I mean, that sounds about right. I think I would have thought that the guerrillas had killed more French forces, but even still, that's still a pretty impactful slice of the pie, I would say, particularly considering that the guerrillas also contributed a lot to harassing French supply lines and communication lines, which also really did a number on the French control of Iberia. And, total deaths, 260,000. That's 260,000 men that Napoleon really needed elsewhere. Now, we have talked about to what extent having those men in Russia would have changed the situation. I don't think it would have made the Russian campaign successful. But it's undoubtable that having those men elsewhere, would have definitely helped Napoleon's war effort. Instead, they were forced to hang around the Iberian Peninsula and slowly die of disease, and fighting with the Spanish, the Brits, and irregular guerrilla forces.
By contrast, British military deaths are estimated at 52,000, Portuguese 15,000, with many more thousands of civilian deaths, while Spanish deaths are unknown, though the country as a whole may have lost as many as 500,000 lives.
Yeah, I mean, the occupation was pretty brutal at points, so I'm not surprised that there were a lot of Spanish deaths, and probably a lot of those were civilian deaths. I mean, we saw this in earlier episodes, but, the atrocities committed by the French, the brutal occupation. So, yeah, it's unsurprising there were a lot of Spanish casualties.
In 5 years of war and occupation. For Napoleon, this disaster had been an unnecessary and largely self-inflicted wound.
Yeah.
An intervention born of arrogance and false assumptions, with dire strategic consequences. But as the Napoleonic Empire crumbled in Spain, an even greater struggle neared its climax in Central Europe, where Napoleon faced the most powerful coalition of his enemies yet. If the French Emperor was victorious in Germany, Wellington might soon be scrambling back across the Pyrenees. The fate of Europe was about to be decided at the Battle of Leipzig.
All right, great video. I'm very excited to get into the next one. I will say, of course, at this time, Napoleon is being pushed now from sort of every direction, but like they just said, if he can win this massive battle, then maybe Wellington's success in Spain won't matter that much. If Napoleon can beat off the other allies, if he can defeat the other allies, then they're exactly right. Wellington may have to, scurry back to the sea and sail back to Britain. It's not over for Napoleon yet. It really isn't. And, we can see in this that obviously Napoleon was a brilliant general, but he certainly made mistakes, as we can see primarily from Spain and Russia. I mean, Russia in particular was really self-inflicted by Napoleon. I think Spain less so, but still to a certain extent was the doing of Napoleon himself. So, Napoleon was very talented, but, he can't go for years and years without making any mistakes, and he's now making some pretty serious ones. And as we know, it's all coming to an end. But at the time, they didn't know that. So, yeah, I'm excited to get into the next video where we're going to see this massive battle that we've sort of been building up to. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, check out the Patreon, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye, everybody.